Once, in an ancient city, raised aloft on a column, a brazen statue of justice stood in the public square, upholding the scales in its left hand, and in its right a sword, as an emblem that justice presided over the laws of the land and the hearts and the homes of the people. But over the course of time, the laws of the land were corrupted. Might took the place of right, and the weak were oppressed, and the mighty ruled with an iron rod. These stirring words by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow from his epic poem Evangeline remind us of the unending cycle of nations. In fact, for the vast majority of the nearly 100 billion people who have ever lived on planet Earth, this pattern of human existence has been all too familiar. What is different about the founding of America? What was the divinely inspired formula used by our founding fathers to bring about the greatest expansion of liberty and prosperity that the world had ever seen? What is our responsibility to carry these ideas forward to the current and unborn generations? Join with me as we review tonight our history and these ideas, and take a step back and gaze at them through the perspective of a patriot. First, I'd like to thank all of you for being here this evening. I was touched, up here I got a little bit different vantage point. As you stood up, I noticed many of you stood up for multiple branches. And you knew the words. Many of you were singing the songs. And it was very touching. That rendition, also sung earlier by the choir, was phenomenal. Absolutely incredible. As I get older, I was talking to my wife. A lot of these things become more sensitive. I always wonder if my dad would cry. And I was a teenager. I said, man, get with it, bro. But as I get a little bit older, these feelings, it's happening to me as well. So bear with me this evening. As we approach Independence Day, I believe that it's important that we consider and thoughtfully review the liberty and freedom that we enjoy. Milton Friedman defined freedom as the absence of coercion. But I would suggest that it goes far deeper than that. Patriotism is a word of action, and your presence here this evening implies that you would agree. I also want to thank all those who coordinated and helped to prepare for this event this evening. Tonight my remarks are grouped into three sections. First is the cycle of nations, wherein we observe an oscillatory pattern in the world history between tyranny and anarchy. Second, we discuss the events which led up to the contract of our fathers, who with the help of divine providence put together the world's greatest political success formula, reflected in our cherished Constitution, which allowed in a little more than a century a small segment of the human family to become the richest and most generous nation in the world. Lastly, we assess our current crisis of conscience and what our responsibilities are as parents, citizens, and patriots. Regarding the cycle of nations, a review of history from the Egyptians to the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Goths, Saxons, Moors, and through the Crusades into the Renaissance and the discovery of the Americas with its conquistadores, to beyond and into many parts of our world today, we see an almost unending pattern or a cycle of the rise and fall of nations, great and small. In nearly all cases, we see a pattern where power is increasingly concentrated into near or total tyranny until it is finally toppled, which then spills forth into anarchy, only to begin slowly concentrating itself back again, and the cycle repeats anew. For much of recorded history, we discover man's cruelty, tyranny, and subjection of others. While there were many periods of great light, almost always they were followed by great tragedy and darkness. Apparently, tyranny is the default state. Into this turbulent and tumultuous cycle, over the course of thousands of years, billions of our fellow brothers and sisters have been born, lived their lives, and passed on their collected knowledge and learning to their descendants. While there are exceptions for large numbers of people, life has been short and difficult. But among the chaos and commotion, we find a most powerful and unique example among the generation of resolute Americans that we call our founding fathers. Under the divine hand of providence and in a most sublime and glorious fashion, they created the first free people to survive as a nation in modern times. They wrote a new kind of constitution, which is now the oldest in existence. They built a commonwealth designed as a model for the whole human race. They believed it was possible to create a nation providing freedom, equality, and justice for all. They envisioned a vast commonwealth able to accommodate 200 to 300 million freemen. They created an expansive new cultural climate which gave eagle's wings to the human spirit. They encouraged exploration and technology to reveal the secrets of the universe. They built a free enterprise culture to promote millions of jobs and unprecedented prosperity. They invented for the world and for themselves a whole new formula of happiness and success. They offered the ultimate hope of humanity, a world of universal freedom, prosperity, and peace. The events which led up to this culmination are myriad, but suffice it to say that around 500 years ago, the human spirit of adventure, combined with religious persecution, compelled a wave of migration to a new world, where a most marvelous work and a wonder was about to occur. When writing about what compelled him, Christopher Columbus, in his own journal, wrote, "Who doubts that this illumination was from the Holy Spirit? I attest that he, with marvelous rays of light, consoled me through the holy and sacred scriptures, and ultimately, continually, without ceasing for a moment, they inflame me with a great sense of urgency." Barely 100 years after Columbus, we see arrivals of courageous and noble souls arriving at sites such as Jamestown and Plymouth and others along the eastern seaboard, largely sponsored by commercial interests, but seeking their religious freedom. These colonies suffered greatly, but with faith, courage, and persistence, soon they began to prosper. They knew that the eyes of the world were upon them. In 1630, Winthrop wrote, who was a pilgrim and the first pioneer of Massachusetts, the first governor of Massachusetts, he wrote, "For we must consider that we are a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. Therefore, let us choose life, that we and our seed may live by obeying God's voice and cleaving to him. For he is our life and our prosperity." In his poem America, Arthur Cleveland Coates wrote, "Came the pilgrims with Winthrop, saint of the West. Came Robert of Jamestown, the brave and the blessed. Undaunted they came every peril to dare, of tribes far fiercer than the wolf in his lair. Of the wild irksome woods where in ambush they lay, of their terror by night and their arrow by day. And the bread of dependence if proudly they spurned, 'twas the soul of their fathers that kindled and burned. 'Twas the blood of old Saxon within them that ran. They held to be free is the birthright of man." The sheer distance from their homeland compelled them to develop systems for governing themselves, always placing their trust in the hand of divine providence. By no means were these times of universal happiness, quite the contrary, but among it all there was a growing sense of self-identity, an undeniable desire to prosper, and a yearning for freedom and self-regulation. As these American colonies continued to expand and prosper over the next 150 years, tensions more frequently arose between Great Britain, and disputes regarding self-governance, taxation, representation, among other things, created an increasingly burdensome situation wherein the budding American colonies began to once again feel that cycle of the gnawing jaws of tyranny clamping down. From 1764 to 1774, a series of acts and laws were passed which heavily constrained the colonists. As the hand of tyranny bore down, patriots like Sam Adams, known as the father of the American Revolution, passionately made the case for liberty when he said, "If ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. We ask not your counsels or arms. Crouch down and lick the hands that feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that you were our countrymen." By 1775, the situation had grown almost unbearable. On March 23rd, Patrick Henry, speaking at the Second Virginia Convention, delivered one of the most powerful oratories in history and summarized in undeniable terms what the Americans were up against. It took the courage and perspective of a patriot to come forth, but he boldly stated, "If I keep back my opinions at such a time, through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason towards my country, and of an act of disloyalty towards the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings." He asked, "Has Great Britain an enemy in this quarter of the world to call for this accumulation of navies and armies? No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet upon us the chains which the British ministry has for so long been forging." After making a compelling case, of impending British military action, he called his countrymen to action with these words: "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Within 4 weeks, Paul Revere had made his 1 if by land, 2 if by sea midnight ride to alert fellow patriots that the British were coming. The next morning, April 19th, 1775, the shot heard around the world was fired on the Green in Lexington and later Concord. Within 2 months, on June 17th at the Battle of Bunker Hill, while a narrow loss for the Americans, it showed that the British were vulnerable. On August 23rd, 1775, King George declared that the colonies were in open rebellion. Rebellion indeed had come, and it was time for the Americans to strike back. At the end of 1775, General George Washington assigned a gregarious 25-year-old self-taught gunner named Henry Knox a most important and difficult task: to transport 59 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in New York to Dorchester Heights in Massachusetts, a distance of nearly 300 miles. It took 80 yoke of oxen with 42 sleds to move the cannons over the winter terrain. They weighed nearly 60 tons. The 3-month journey culminated on March 4th, 1776, when 2,000 men and 400 oxen hauled the cannons up Dorchester Heights under the cover of darkness. The following morning, as a providential cover of heavy fog dissipated, the British general looked up in shock at the ominous cannons pointing right back at Boston. In amazement, he declared, "The rebels have done more in one night than could my entire army have done in a month. It must have been the work of at least 12,000 men." Intimidated, the British withdrew, and Boston became a free city, and Henry Knox was made a brigadier general. This is the same Henry Knox for which Kentucky's very own Fort Knox is named. By May of 1776, they all knew that independence was the only option. They had been trying for years to reconcile. They had remonstrated, they had petitioned, queried, and pled. They had exhausted all available avenues, eventually arriving at consensus that the only reasonable option for decent men was to forcefully break free and to declare their independence. On June 11, 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft an official declaration of independence from Britain. Spearheaded by Thomas Jefferson, then only 33 years old and the youngest member of the Continental Congress, was assigned the important task. The final draft was presented to Congress only 2 weeks later. The final document was ratified on July 4, 1776, and it would shine forth as an unmatched beacon and one of the brightest lights in the entire canon of human discourse. It contains the words which Steve read at the beginning. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." They declared their independence, and they listed line by line each of the usurpations and the challenges that they were faced with King George of England. They listed all these reasons very clearly so that other men, rational men, could understand that they were not acting out of a haughty response, but that they had their reasons that were founded in realities. Perhaps equally sublime were the words that were contained at the end of the Declaration. They stated, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And with these words, freedom was born on July 4, 1776, when 56 of our founding fathers signed their names and declared these American colonies a free and independent nation. It was considered to be tantamount to signing a death warrant. England had the best trained and best equipped army in the world. The 13 colonies were nothing more than a bunch of farmers with rifles. What chance did they possibly have? Even so, they believed in God Almighty, and they placed this nation firmly in His hand. On that historic day, the signers of the Declaration pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They did so to birth the land of the free and the home of the brave. Much has been written of these men, but much more possibly has been forgotten. A man on the street interview conducted today in one of our bustling cities would most likely reveal nothing more than blank stares when asked about these 56 men who swore an oath of their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. These were men of means, They were men of intellect. They were men of great spirituality. They had much to lose, but they gave it up gladly for your freedom and for mine. Permit me to give you a quick summary of what happened to a couple of them. After signing the Declaration, the British looted and burned all the properties of Clymer, Hall, Gwinnett, Walton, Hayward, Rutledge, Middleton, and Ellery. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter and a merchant, saw half of his 14 ships swept from the 7 seas. To pay his debts, he lost his home. He lost all his properties. His health failed, and he died in rags. He pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. He kept his honor. He lost his fortune, and he lost his life for your freedom and mine. Thomas Nelson of Virginia raised nearly $2 million on his own signature for the provision of the Continental Army. And $2 million then, as now, but much more then, is a lot of money. In the final battle of Yorktown, he urged General Washington to fire on his own home, which had been taken over by General Cornwallis of the British. His home was totally destroyed. After the war, he personally paid back those loans, and he was never reimbursed by our government. He wiped out his entire estate. He died bankrupt and was buried in an unmarked grave. He pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. He gave his life and his fortune, but he kept his sacred honor. John Hart was driven by the British from his wife's bedside while she was dying. Their 13 children fled in all directions for their lives. His fields were burned and his gristmill was laid waste by the British. For more than a year, he lived in a cave in the forest. He returned home after the war was over to find his wife dead, his 13 children gone, his properties consumed. He died a few weeks later of a broken heart. He pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. He lost his life, he lost his fortune, but he kept his sacred honor. The stark realities of battle with the British soon had their effect and nearly decimated our troops. Yet, from Trenton to Valley Forge to Monmouth to Kings Mountain to Cowpens and eventually victory at Yorktown, through 8 years of bitter struggle, we finally won our independence in 1783. Yet independence for America was an unstable proposition. The founders, well aware of the cycle of nations as they shift between tyranny and anarchy, had ratified the Articles of Confederation so far away from tyranny towards anarchy that their confederation was nearly powerless to provide stable government. By 1786, Shays' Rebellion showed that without a stronger form of government, this loose coalition of states would soon fall apart. As a result, General George Washington was called out of his retirement. And by May 1787, delegates had gathered to discuss their plans to form a more perfect union and to revitalize our nation. At the convention were some of the most inspired, intelligent, and insightful minds that have ever lived. These men came from many different social backgrounds, including everything from the frontier poverty of wilderness pioneering to the opulent wealth of aristocracy. They ranged from farmers to physicians to the presidents of universities. Their dialects ranged from the loquacious South Carolina drawl to the clipped staccato of New England. But these founding fathers were educated students of world history. They understood the ins and outs of various forms of government, and more importantly, they understood the foibles of man. Instead of trying to will away man's innate predilection for power, they sought to form a government which acknowledged and made clear provision for the separation of power between 3 separate but equal branches of government. Over 4 hot and humid months, they debated in excruciating detail all aspects of government, their likely abuses, and how to address them. They knew that power must not be concentrated, that checks and balances were necessary. They knew that between the extremes of tyranny, or ruler's law, and anarchy, which is no law at all, there was an ideal balance of power called the people's law, wherein government of, by, and for the people could be given just sufficient power to provide protection for the natural rights of men, that is, the right of life, liberty, and property. The federal government was to be given clear and specific powers, with the remainder to be explicitly retained by the states or the people. It was truly a work of divine art. Their success formula included provisions and compromises for many challenging issues and struck a balance, allowing for consensus between widely varied interests on a litany of complicated issues. We know that the hand of God played a mighty role in the creation of this most unique and seminal document. On September 17th, 1787, The president of the convention, George Washington, and 41 others officially signed the document. Its 6 main objectives were clearly laid out in its preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Charles Pinckney, an active participant and author of a key provision, said that when the great work was done and published, I was struck with amazement. Nothing less than the superintending hand of God that so miraculously carried us through the war could have brought it about. Yet the document requires a certain moral baseline to achieve its effect. John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other." As the delegates left the convention, a woman asked Benjamin Franklin what kind of government they had created. He replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." A republic is different than a democracy. In a democracy, the majority can make the laws, while in a republic, elected representatives make the laws. The word democracy is not mentioned at all in the Constitution, and most of the founders distrusted pure democracy. They equated it more with mob rule. James Madison showed that throughout history, democracies have been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. John Adams noted that there was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. It is important for us to keep in mind the important differences between pure democracy and the limited constitutional republic that our Constitution provides. This same year, in 1787, the Scottish historian and philosopher Alexander Tytler is attributed with similar astute comments about the nature of democracies when he said, quote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidate who promises the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by dictatorship. The average age," he continues, "the average age of the world's greatest civilizations from the beginning of history has been about 200 years. During those 200 years, these nations have always progressed through the following sequence." Take note. From bondage to spiritual faith. From spiritual faith to great courage. From courage to liberty. From liberty to abundance. From abundance to selfishness. From selfishness to complacency. From complacency to apathy. From apathy to dependence. And from dependence back into bondage. Unquote. Does this sound familiar? Brothers and sisters, fellow citizens, let us take a step back and look at the Tytler cycle through the eyes and perspective of a patriot. America is now 239 years old. Where are we now in this cycle? As a nation, we're becoming increasingly dependent on the government. Think for me. Provide for me. I'm not responsible for me. You're responsible for me. As we look at our current situation as a nation, we find ourselves in a crisis of conscience. What are our duties as patriots, and how should we define patriotism in our day? I submit that patriotism is not blindfolded cheering on of our country for the emotional feelings that may bring. True patriotism is a deep and abiding respect for the bedrock principles and values upon which this nation is formed, and a clear understanding of why those principles are necessary elements to maximize our freedom. We must understand what it took in terms of the lives, fortunes, and sacred honor of others to catapult our nation to peak prosperity. We must understand where we are on the Tytler cycle and take action to ensure our liberty. Closing, permit me to share a brief example of everyday patriotism from a recent experience in my own life. A few weeks ago, our family had the opportunity to attend an honor flight here in Louisville. If you've never been, I strongly suggest you find out when the next one is and that you go. It's a phenomenal experience. We had the opportunity to welcome home veterans from World War II, from Korea, from Vietnam, as they were returning from the nation's capital to visit the monuments that are made in honor of them. It was an incredible experience and one which our family has and will continue to cherish. At that event, my 9-year-old son, Soldier, had the opportunity to shake hands with these heroes and to show them respect. A young Iraq veteran, Ryan Murphy, was also in attendance with his wife and small children. President Smith was here with my son, set him up, perched him up right at the end of the line. As all these veterans walked through, Soldier was at the end, smiling, waving his flag. As he sat there perched up on that chair, Ryan Murphy saw him. He saw a soldier shaking the hands of these veterans. He looked at him in the face, saw the innocence in his eyes and possibly the freckles on his face. And he was immediately reminded of a fallen brother in arms whose mother is here this evening. Lynn Romans is here. Stand up, Lynn. Lynn Romans is here with us this evening. Thanks, Lynn. On September 29, 2003, Sergeant Darren K. Potter, Lynn's son, Kentucky National Guardsman, was stationed outside of Baghdad when his 4-vehicle convoy on patrol came under mortar attack, causing the Humvee he was in to careen into a nearby canal. Potter acted quickly and made sure that his men were safe and out of the vehicle. But he himself was subsequently swept away by the swift currents. In so doing, he became the first Kentucky National Guardsman to give his life in the service of his country since Vietnam. Potter understood the value of true patriotism and duty. He died a hero's death. With his actions, he gave his life, his fortune, and he sealed his sacred honor. As Ryan Murphy watched my son Soldier that night, a feeling immediately welled up within him, and he felt compelled to remove this bracelet, memorial bracelet which he had worn for 12 years in memory of his fellow brother, Sergeant Potter. As he looked at Soldier, he took the bracelet off and he gave it to him. As a young boy, as a means to pass on the embodiment of respect, tradition, and honor to the rising generation. Ryan Murphy was unable to make it this evening because he's with his wife right now and his small children while she's serving at Wright-Patterson Air Base on active duty. But I would like to thank him for passing on his patriotism to my son and for the impact it's had on my family. Even more, I'd like to thank Lynn Romans, who's here, Sergeant Potter's mother, for raising a man of honor who is now memorialized as a hero. Patriotism requires effort. It is an active word. True patriotism requires that we learn the basis upon which our freedoms rest and that we preserve and protect the ideals which support it. We must understand with clear eyes, as Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States when men were free. The American people are now 250 years away from our nation's original founding. Our ship of state is far out to sea and is being tossed in stormy waters. Do we have the courage of a patriot to hold fast? I have a question for each of you here. Is there anything you believe that's worth putting your life and your reputation in jeopardy for? At what point will you, as a Bible-believing Christian, object to the moral corruption being forced upon your children in the public schools? Will you object if your children are routinely indoctrinated in the ideology of socialism? Will you let your children grow up in a dictatorship? Will you object if imperfect babies are killed in hospitals before they're born, after they're born? Will you object if the state tells your church what can and cannot be said out of the Bible if it's read word for word under the guise that it's hate speech, with the objective being to silence the church? Will you object if your church loses its nonprofit status and is heavily taxed? Will you object if the state assumes ownership of your children and tells parents how they must raise their children under penalty of losing custody? Will you object if universities refuse to grant degrees to outspoken Christian students? Will you object when Congress and the state take more than 50% of your income on taxation? At what point are you willing to say, enough is enough? Will you risk to speak if every tenet of your faith is legislated against in Congress or in your home state? Is there a freedom or principle that you would defend with your life, your fortune, and your sacred honor? Would you risk your name being on the front page of a newspaper, saying ugly things about you because you said something, God forbid, that was politically incorrect? All of these things that I just mentioned are in process in America. And if the powers that be have their way, that's going to happen. At what point are you willing to stand up and say, enough is enough, and speak up? Christians of America, we are at war for the soul of America. Compromise with the world is treason against God. You are the salt and the light. Yet if the salt loses its saltiness, it's good for nothing but to be trampled under the feet of men. The reason why many churches in America have lost their force is because of the good hot tub Christianity which transforms no one. If there ever was a time in America to hear thunder from the pulpits, that time is now. I hear an echo from Valley Forge. I see an American patriot standing with his head bandaged, soaked in blood. He has no shoes because a third of them didn't have them. And the burlap is soaked in blood. He's hungry. He's standing in the snow. He's holding his musket. And he looks to the future at this audience tonight. And he says, I stood in the snow of Valley Forge without shoes to give you the right to vote. And you stay home on election day because the weather's bad. I hear a voice from Valley Forge saying, I left my family destitute so that you could have the freedom of speech, and you remain silent because it might be bad for business, or someone might think you're a hate monger, or God forbid, politically incorrect. I hear an echo from Valley Forge saying, I orphaned my children to give you a government to serve you, and through neglect you've permitted your government to become the master of your children and the master of your lives. Stand up, America, for your portrait in 2015. We are a nation whose constitution has been hijacked by federal activist judges who are at war with we the people, and certainly at war with the recognition that we are one nation under God. Let us remember that liberty is lost due to apathy and ignorance, but it is only won back at the price of bloodshed. Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and to be free, it expects what never was and never will be. I reverence the Constitution of the United States of America as a sacred document. To me, its words are akin to the revelations of God, for God himself has placed his stamp of approval upon it. May God give us the faith and the courage exhibited by those patriots who pledged their lives, their honor, and their fortunes. May we be equally as valiant and as free. Let us remember the cycle of nations, the contract of our fathers, and our current crisis of conscience. Let us embrace the inspired ideals of the American system. Let us be true patriots for God, for country, for family. Laus Deo, and God bless America. Thank you.